The first frost of the season had silvered the windows of the great drawing-room at Harrowfield when Cordelia Vane crossed it alone, and every diamond in that glittering company turned to watch the widow do it. She wore black as she had worn black for 2 years, and the gown was good but old, mended once at the left cuff, where no one was meant to look. On the third finger of her gloved hand sat a man's signet ring, too large for her, turned inward against her palm so the gold would not catch the candlelight. She had not removed it since the morning they had buried Edmund. The room had decided long ago what she was, a widow with debts and a borrowed name, past the season's interest, clinging to a dead man's house as though grief were a kind of rent she might pay forever. None of them knew the ring. None of them had ever looked closely enough to see it. At the far end of the room, beneath the cold blaze of a chandelier, the Duke of Ashbourne stood, as he always stood, apart from the people he was obliged to stand among. He was not a man others approached without reason. There was a stillness in him that the season had learned to read as pride, and a coldness in the set of his mouth that no debutante had managed to thaw in the 3 years since he had come into the title. He had crossed England that autumn for a single dull purpose, the settling of a neighbor's estate, and he had not expected to feel anything in a drawing-room ever again. Then a woman in old black walked the length of the floor with a soldier's straight back, and something at her hand caught the light for half a second before she hid it, and the Duke went very still in a way that had nothing to do with pride. He did not know yet what he had seen. He only knew that his eye had snagged on it the way a thread snags on a nail, and that he could not now make himself look away. Stay with me through to the end, because what the widow carries on her hand is not what this room believes it to be, and the man across the floor is the only soul in England who could know the difference. The rest of them had already decided her story. They were wrong. Cordelia took her place by the window because the window was the one spot in the room where no one wished to stand. The cold came off the glass in a thin, steady breath, and she welcomed it, because it gave her face a reason to be pale and her hands a reason to fold. She was 26 years old. 2 winters ago she had been a wife. Edmund Vane had not been rich, and the little he had left her was eaten now by the lawyers, and the long, slow business of a will that named her in one breath and stripped her in the next, and the house she lived in was not truly hers, but held in a trust she did not understand and could not afford to fight. She had come to Harrowfield tonight, because Lady Marwood had invited her out of a charity that felt worse than refusal, and because to refuse would have been to admit she had nowhere else to be. Across the room, a fan lowered, and a voice carried the way. Voices carry when they are meant to. It belonged to the Dowager Countess of Brantz, a woman whose place in the world had been settled before Cordelia was born, and who guarded that place the way a sentry guards a gate. She did not trouble to lower her voice for the widow, because the widow did not signify. The widow with her one black gown, she said to the young woman, seated at her right hand, Res. Still bearing the mourning 2 years on, as though the world owed her something for a husband no one remembers. A woman ought to know when her season is finished. The young woman beside her smiled the practiced smile of someone who has been told all her life she is the answer to a question, and said nothing because she did not need to. Her name was Lady Honoria Brantz, and she wore a gown the color of ice over water, and the dowager had brought her into the room, the way a jeweler brings a stone into the light. Cordelia heard every word. She had learned, in 2 years, to keep her face still while her chest did something else entirely. Her fingers closed once around the ring at her palm, and then let it go. The house she kept in the village of Ashbycombe was a narrow stone thing, with a door that swelled in the wet, and a parlor that took 3 scuttles of coal a day to keep from weeping damp. And she kept it with one servant, an old woman named Beck, who had served Edmund's mother and had refused when the wages stopped. Beck was the only soul in the world who called Cordelia by her given name and meant it kindly. It was Beck who pressed the one black gown each season, until the nap wore thin. Beck who turned the cuffs and let down the hems. Beck who had stood at the foot of Edmund's bed at the end and held the basin and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Cordelia had nothing to leave the old woman, and they both knew it, and neither of them spoke of it, and that silence was its own kind of love. On the worst Thursdays, when Mr. Cottis Pell had come and gone, Beck would set a cup of weak tea at Cordelia's elbow without a word, and rest one hand a moment on her shoulder, and that was all. And it was a great deal. What the room did not know was that the gold she hid was not Edmund's at all. The signet had come to her husband from his own father, and to that man from his. And the device cut into its face was not the Vane device, because the Vanes had never owned it. Edmund had told her the story once, on a night when the fire was low and his fever was high, and she had not understood the whole of it then, and there had been no one to ask since. He had pressed it into her hand at the very last and made her promise to keep it on her, and she had kept that promise the way a drowning woman keeps hold of a rope without examining why. He had said that night that the ring would speak for her one day when she had no voice left, and she had thought it the wandering of a fevered mind, and had wept, and had promised him anything he asked, and had not asked what he meant. There had been no time. By morning he was gone, and the lawyers had come, and the ring had gone inward against her palm, and the world had begun the long business of deciding. She was nothing. She did not see the Duke watching her. She had trained herself not to look at the corners of rooms where titled men stood, because looking was a thing that cost a woman like her too much. So she did not see him take one step toward the window, then check himself, then turn to a footman and ask a quiet question and receive an answer that made the muscle in his jaw go tight. The first proximity came an hour later, and it came because the Dowager arranged it, though she would never have called it that. A glass of ratafia had been spilled near the card tables, and in the small confusion of it, Cordelia found herself moved by the press of the crowd toward the terrace doors, and the Duke was already there, and there was suddenly no graceful distance left between them. She inclined her head as rank required. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at her, and she felt the look the way one feels a change in the weather somewhere below thought. Then his eyes went to her hand deliberately, and did not pretend they had not. "You are cold," he said. It was not a question. Come away from the glass. The command in it ought to have offended her. Instead it landed somewhere she had kept locked, and her body answered before her pride could stop it, a small warmth climbing her throat, an awareness of exactly how near he stood. She did not move. "I am quite well, Your Grace," she said. He did not argue. He simply shifted half a pace, so that his shoulder came between her and the draught from the doors, and went on speaking of nothing, of the frost, of the lateness of the year, while the cold he had displaced settled instead across his own back. She noticed it. She told herself she had imagined it. "That ring," he said at last very low, so that no one else could hear. "Where did you come by it?" And Cordelia, who had answered 100 cruelties without flinching, found she could not answer kindness at all, and turned the gold further into her palm, and said only that it had been her husband's, and that she did not speak of him. The Duke went quiet. Something moved behind his eyes that she could not name. He did not press her. He bowed and let her go, and watched her cross back to her cold window. And for the rest of that long evening, he did not approach another soul. You felt that, did you not? The way the room narrowed to two people who had agreed to pretend nothing had happened. Hold on to that. It will matter more than either of them yet knows. In the days that followed, the season did what the season does. It talked. Lady Marwood, who meant well and did harm, repeated to Cordelia over weak tea that the Dowager had been heard to call her a fortune-hunting widow, draping herself in black to catch the eye of a duke who would not look twice at a woman with nothing. The phrase traveled. By the end of the week it had been said in 3 drawing-rooms, and in each one it gathered weight. And Cordelia, who had caught a duke's eye without trying, and wanted nothing he could give her, learned the new shape the world had decided to press her into. She did not weep. She had a household to keep, and a creditor named Mr. Pell to manage, a thin, sharp man who came on Thursdays with a ledger and a way of looking at her furniture as though he had already sold it. It was a Thursday when the Duke saw the thing that changed him, though Cordelia never knew he had been there to see it. He had ridden out to the village, on the edge of his neighbor's land. The rain had come down hard and gray, and he had taken shelter under the eave of the apothecary's shop, and through the streaming window he had watched a woman in old black kneel in the mud of the lane, beside a child who had fallen. The child was the chandler's boy, no more than 5, and he had cut his hand on a broken crock, and the other women had drawn their skirts back from the mess of it. One had said plainly enough for the Duke to read it on her lips, that the boy ought to be more careful, and had walked on. Cordelia had not. She had knelt in the wet and torn a strip from her own petticoat and bound the small hand, and spoken to the boy in a voice the Duke could not hear but could read in the loosening of the child's shoulders. She had wiped the rain and the tears from the small face with her own bare thumb, careless of the mud, and held the bound hand up to the boy's eyes, and shown him it was mended, and the child had stopped crying, and looked at his hand as though it were a marvel. When the boy's mother came running, white with fear, Cordelia had risen only enough to take the woman's 2 hands and steady her, and had pressed a coin into them. A coin the Duke knew, from the look of the woman's clothes and the look of her own, she could not spare. The mother had tried to give it back. Cordelia had closed the woman's fingers over it, and shaken her head, and said something that made the mother stop arguing. And then she had risen, mud to the knee, the hem of the one black gown ruined past Beck's mending, and gone on her way as though nothing had happened, because, to her, nothing had. The Duke stood under the eave a long time after she had gone. The rain ran off the slates above him in a thin gray rope, and he did not move out of its reach. He was a man who had spent 3 years learning to distrust the surfaces of people, because a surface had once cost him everything. What he had seen through the rain was not a surface. A woman who knelt in mud for a child she would never be thanked by, who gave a coin she could not spare to a stranger and refused to be seen doing it, was not a woman performing virtue for an audience. There had been no audience. There had been only the rain and a frightened child and a coin, and she had not known the Duke watched. And so the thing he had seen was true. He went home and did not sleep, and in the long hours before dawn he found himself touching the breast of his coat where the small silver disc lay, as he did when something had moved in him that he did not yet have words for. What had cost him everything was a name he did not speak. 3 years before, the man he had trusted above all others, his own steward and the friend of his boyhood, had forged the Duke's hand across a season of accounts and ruined 2 tenant families before the fraud was found. And the Duke had been slow to see it because he had not wished to see it. And one of those families had a daughter who did not survive the winter they were turned out. He had paid for it since in the only coin he had, which was vigilance, and he had let no one near enough to deceive him again. He kept the dead girl's christening medal in the breast pocket of every coat he owned, a small worn disc of silver he never showed, and he touched it, sometimes without knowing he did it, the way a man touches a scar to be sure it is still there. He had believed until a woman knelt in the mud that he would carry that medal alone to the end of his life. The next proximity was the library at Harrowfield, 3 nights on, and it was not arranged by anyone. Cordelia had gone there to escape a dance. She had not been asked to join, and she had thought the room empty, and it was not. The Duke stood at the tall window with a book unopened in his hand, and the candlelight catching the side of his face. He did not pretend surprise. "I hoped you would come this way," he said, which was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 2 years, and she did not know what to do with it. They spoke. He asked her nothing of debts or duty. He asked her what she had been before she was a widow, and she found herself telling him of her father's small library in the north, the books sold one by one to pay for his last illness. The morning the man had come with the cart and she had watched the shelves go bare a row at a time, and had memorized the spines so she would have them somewhere. She told him of the one volume she had kept back and hidden, a worn copy of Cowper, that had been her mother's, and how she read it still, on the nights the cold kept her from sleeping. The Duke listened the way a man listens who has decided the speaker matters, his thumb moving once across the unopened cover of the book in his own hand. When she rose to go, he said low and level, "Sit a moment longer," and she sat, and her heart was loud in her own ears, and she was ashamed of how much she wished the moment would not end. He did not touch her. His hand came near her gloved wrist, where it rested on the chair arm, and stopped, a breath above it, and stayed there a long instant while neither of them moved, and the not touching was louder than any touch could have been. She was aware of the warmth of his hand even through the small distance of air, aware of the exact place where his fingers hovered above the worn kid of her glove, aware that if she turned her wrist by half an inch they would be touching, and that she must not turn her wrist. Her breath went shallow. She kept her eyes on the dark window and the snow beginning beyond it, and did not let herself look at his hand, because to look would be to want, and to want was a thing she could not afford. Then he drew back. Outside the door the music swelled, and someone laughed, and the world that had decided what she was waited just beyond the candlelight, and Cordelia rose and made her curtsy, and went back to it, and her wrist burned where he had not touched it the whole long way across the room. The dowager had marked the library. Of course she had. A woman who guards a gate notices when something passes through it. The second voicing of the label came 2 days later in the full hearing of a public room, when the Duke entered a card party at Lady Marwood's, and the dowager, seeing his eye go at once to the widow by the wall, said clearly across the table that it was a pity some women could not grieve with dignity, but must turn even mourning into a lure. The fortune-hunting widow, she said, and let the words sit in the open air. The room did not laugh. The room did the worst thing, which was to fall quiet and look. Cordelia felt the heat climb her face and willed it down. Her hand found the ring, and held it. And the Duke, who had crossed 3 years of careful coldness, set down his cards, and said into the silence, in a voice without heat, that he had found the lady's conduct, in every particular, more honorable than the company she was made to keep. Then he asked her formally before them all whether she would take a turn with him on the floor, and she could not refuse without making the insult hers. And so she went, and the season had something new to talk about, and the dowager's fan came up a half-inch too high. That night the Duke walked her to her carriage himself, which he had no right to do, and at the carriage door he said, the thing she had been afraid of, "I mean to call on you," he said, "not as the season calls. Tell me I may." And Cordelia, who wanted it more than she had wanted anything since Edmund died, heard her own voice say that he must not, that she had nothing, that he did not know what the world already said of her, that to be seen with her would cost him what a man of his rank could not afford to spend. He listened. Then he said, "That is my account to keep, not yours," and shut the carriage door gently, and stepped back, and let her go into the dark. She pressed the ring to her lips on the long, cold ride home, and did not let herself cry. He called the next afternoon. He came on a Thursday, which was the day she had not wanted any soul to see, because Thursday was the day of Mr. Prock, Pell. And the two men met in her small front room, the creditor, with his ledger, and the Duke with his unreadable face, Mr. Branney. Pell was a thin, sharp man, who came each week and stood too long before the good walnut sideboard that had been Edmund's mother's, running one finger along its edge as though pricing it, and he did this now, in front of the Duke, not knowing who the Duke was. He named a sum she owed against the house, and a date by which it must be found, the New Year, and he said it twice, slowly, watching her face for the flinch, and got it, and let his mouth curl. Beck stood in the doorway with the tea things, and did not bring them in because she would not pour for Mr. Pell. The Duke watched all of this from the chair by the cold hearth without moving and without speaking, and his stillness filled the small room until even Mr. Pell felt it and glanced at him uncertainly. The Duke did not offer to pay. She understood, later, that he had known better than to insult her so, in front of the man who had come to shame her. He only watched and listened, and at the end, he asked Mr. Sink Pell one quiet question about the trust that held the house, and another about the name of the solicitor who managed it, and Mr. Bedia. Pell, who had not been asked a sensible question in years, and could not resist showing his cleverness, told him. The name was Thorne. The creditor said old Thorne in Marbury, who had clerked for the great families 40 years, and knew where every county skeleton was buried. The Duke thanked him with a courtesy so cold it stopped the man's mouth, and Mr. Pell took up his ledger and his hat and went, and the room let out a breath when the door shut behind him. When the creditor had gone, the Duke looked at Cordelia for a long moment and said, "Eat something, you have gone white." And she laughed, despite herself, a small broken sound, because it was the most absurd and the kindest thing. And he almost smiled, and did not. Beck brought the tea then, and a little bread, and the Duke watched until Cordelia had eaten, and only then did he speak again. "I have spent 3 years," he said, "keeping every person in England at the length of my arm, because the last time I let someone close, it cost a life I could not give back. I did not come here today to settle your debt. I came because I have not been able to think of anything but you since I saw you in the rain." And a man who has trained himself to feel nothing does not say such a thing lightly. And I find I do not wish to take it back. He said it the way he said everything, level and plain, no heat in it, and that was why it undid her. She had been wanted before, by men who wanted a house or a face or a soft place to put their cruelty. She had not in all her life been wanted by someone who had looked first and decided after. "That ring," he said again, before he left. "Will you let me see it?" And this time, because he had stood between her and the cold, and between her and the room and asked nothing in return, she drew off her glove with shaking fingers and turned the gold outward into the light, for the first time in 2 years, and let him take her bare hand in his and look. He went very still. She felt the change in his grip before she understood it. The device cut into the worn gold was a heron standing in reeds beneath a single star, and it was not, he said, in a voice gone strange and low, a thing her husband's family had any right to bear. It was the device of Ashbourne. It was his own. It was the ring of the second son of the third Duke, his great-uncle Lionel, who had quarreled with the house and gone to sea and been written out and mourned and forgotten 60 years before, and whose line the family had believed long extinct. He turned her hand in the candlelight and read the small letters worn almost to nothing inside the band, and named them, and they were the initials of a man whose portrait still hung, turned to the wall in a gallery at his own estate, because the family had not been able to bring themselves to take it down. "Edmund Vane," he said slowly, "was the grandson of Lionel Ashbourne. Your husband, madam, was my cousin, and you, his widow, are kin to the house that has let a duchess call you." Nothing. The candle guttered between them. Cordelia did not speak. She had carried the proof of it against her palm for 2 years, and had not known, and had been called a fortune hunter for wearing the one true thing she owned. "I have kept you long enough today," the Duke said, and his hand tightened once on hers before he released it. "I want you to know before I go that I have seen the whole of you now, and I do not mean to look away." Then he was gone, and she sat in the cold front room, with the ring turned outward at last, and the heron stood in its reeds beneath its star, and she understood for the first time why Edmund had made her promise. The dowager understood it sooner than she should have, because the dowager had a solicitor of her own, and solicitors talk. She understood that the widow she had named a fortune hunter was about to be acknowledged by the very house she had used the widow's distance from to flatter her own granddaughter, and she did the thing that confident people do when their certainty is threatened, which was to move faster and harder before the ground could shift. She called on Cordelia herself, unannounced, on a gray morning, and sat in the small front room as though she owned it and did not waste words. "You will leave the county before the new year," she said. "There is a sum I am prepared to settle on you to do it. You will not see the Duke again. He is to marry my granddaughter. The matter is as good as arranged, and a clever woman in your position does not stand in the path of a thing that cannot be stopped." She set a folded bank draft on the table between them. "The fortune-hunting widow," she said for the 3rd time, soft now, almost gentle, knows when to take what she is offered. 3 settings, 3 voicings, and each had cost Cordelia something. Yet the 3rd was set in her own front room, across her own dead husband's hearth. and it was the first time the words had been spoken to her face by the person who had made them, and something in Cordelia that had been bending for 2 years did not bend. She rose. She did not raise her voice. She told the dowager that the house she sat in had been her husband's and her husband's grandfather's before him, and that the name the dowager guarded so carefully was by the device on a ring the dowager had never bothered to look at, partly her husband's own. She did not take the draught. She walked the dowager to the door the way a hostess walks a guest, with perfect courtesy, and shut it, and then she put her back against it and shook. What she did next was the act that delivered her, though she could not have known it. Then, she did not run to the Duke. She did not show him the dowager's draught and let him fight her battle. She took the ring and a letter Edmund had left her with it that she had never been able to open, and she went herself to the solicitor, whose name the Duke had drawn out of Mr. Shea. Pell, the one man in the county who held the papers of the Vane Trust, and she laid the ring on his desk and asked him plainly to tell her what her husband had truly left her, and whether the device on the gold meant what the Duke had said it meant. The solicitor, an old, careful man named Mr. Bincha. Thorn took one look at the heron in the reeds and rose from his chair, because he had been clerk to the family these 40 years, and he knew that device as he knew his own hand, and he had wondered since the day Edmund's will crossed his desk whether the day would come when someone would think to ask. He took the ring to the window and held it to the light, and read the worn letters inside the band with a glass, his hands not quite steady. And then he went to a locked press in the corner of the office, drew out a bundle of papers tied in faded tape that he said he had kept these 2 years against just such a morning. There was the will, and behind the will an older paper, a record of the marriage of one Thomas Vane to a daughter of a sailor named Lionel, who had given his children a device and little else, and behind that a copy brown with age of the very page on which Lionel Ashbourne had been struck from his family's record. Mr. First. Thorn laid them out on his desk, one beside the next, the whole chain of it, and traced the line with one ink-stained finger from the sailor to the grandson to the widow who sat across from him in a mended black gown, and he said, in the dry voice of a man who has waited a long time to say a true thing, that she had been a daughter of the house of Ashbourne by marriage for as long as she had worn that ring, and that no dowager in England could unsay a thing the parish registers had already said. He asked her leave to draw the proof up properly sealed and witnessed, so that it could not be argued. She gave it. She walked out of his office into the cold Marbury Street, with her own future folded in her chest, like a letter she had finally learned how to read. The new year came in cold and clear, and with it the great 12th night ball at Harrowfield, the same glittering room where the season had first decided what Cordelia Vane was. The dowager was there, and Lady Honoria in ice blue at her hand, and the whole company that had fallen quiet and looked. Cordelia came late in the one black gown. The ring turned outward now upon her bare third finger for any soul who cared to see. She did not come to be chosen. She came because Mr. Gotteris. Thorn had asked her to, and because the Duke had sent her one line in his level hand that said, "Only be there, trust me once." The room marked her entrance the way it had marked it in the autumn, with the small cruelty of turned heads and lowered fans, and the dowager's voice began to rise toward a fourth unkindness that the room would have swallowed as it had swallowed the rest. It never arrived. The Duke of Ashbourne crossed the floor. He did not hurry. He crossed it in the long, even stride of a man who has decided a thing, and will not be moved from it. And the company parted before him without knowing why. And he came to a stop before the widow in old black, and the room went so quiet that the fire could be heard. He took her bare hand, the one that wore the heron and the star. He turned it once, so that the candlelight fell full on the gold, and lifted it so the nearest of them could see, and Mr. Black. Thorn stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, with the papers of the trust in his hand, the proof drawn up and sealed. The device matched, the line confirmed. And into the held silence the Duke said the thing that ended it. "She is my cousin's widow, and under my protection, 8 words. He let them fall, and did not soften them, and did not say more because more was not needed, and he was not a man to humiliate where a fact would serve. The room understood at once. To be under the protection of the House of Ashbourne was not a courtesy. It was a wall. It meant the trust would be set right, and the creditors sent away, and the name the dowager had used as a weapon turned in an instant into a shield. It meant the woman this season had decided to forget was kin to the greatest house in the county, and had been all along, and had borne their contempt without once reaching for the gold at her hand to silence them. The dowager's fan came down, for the first time. In the length of the season, her face was not arranged. She looked at the ring, and at Mr. Thorne's sealed papers, and at her granddaughter's stricken stillness and the certainty that had organized her whole long life cracked clean across, and she sat, because her legs would not hold her, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say. Lady Honoria, who had been told her whole life that she was the answer, understood in that moment that she had been the answer to a question no one had truly asked, and there was more grief in her face than malice. And the Duke, who escalated nothing beyond what was needed, gave her a small, grave bow that let her keep what dignity the night had left her. He did not gloat. He had never wished to ruin anyone. He had only wished once in his life to see clearly and to act on what he saw. Cordelia stood at the center of the room that had spent a season looking through her, and let herself, for one moment, be looked at. Later, when the company had thinned and the musicians had gone and the great fire was burning low, the Duke found her by the same cold window where she had stood the first night. Except the window was not cold now, because someone had built the fire high. He did not command her this time. He asked whether, when the trust was settled, and her husband's name restored, and the world set as right as he could set it, she would consider letting him court her in the slow, proper way she deserved, not as the rescue of a widow, but as the choosing of a woman, and Cordelia, who had spent 2 years, certain she would never be chosen, found she could answer kindness. Now she said yes. She said it quietly, the way she said everything, and it was enough. If Cordelia's long winter moved you, stay a moment more, because the last image is the one I most want you to carry. The following spring came late to that part of England, but it came. The house that had been held in trust against her was hers now. Plainly and freely, the papers settled, and Mr. Rincher. Pell paid off and gone. And on a mild evening near the end of April she sat in her own front room, which was warm now and well lit, with the Duke in the chair across from her hearth as though he had always belonged there, which in a way of blood he had. The portrait of Lionel had been brought down at last from the gallery and turned to face the room, and the old sailor looked out of it with the same heron device, cut small in the ring on his painted hand. On the table between them sat Edmund's letter, opened now, read now, a plain few lines from a dying man asking only that his wife be kept safe by whatever kin remained, a wish that had taken the long way round and arrived. Cordelia turned the signet on her finger, the gold warm at last from the fire and from her own hand, the heron standing forever in its reeds beneath its single star. She had worn it to be near the man she had lost. She would wear it now into the life she had been given. Outside the window, the first green was coming back to the dark trees, and inside the small warm room 2 people sat in the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled, and the ring caught the firelight and held it. Thank you for staying to the end of Cordelia's story. If a moment of it stayed with you, leave it in a comment, and I will read every one.